President Richard Nixon aimed to steer the United States toward a more conservative direction during his time in office. He wanted to reduce the power of the federal government, and his plan for this was called New Federalism. The idea behind New Federalism was to shift more power from the federal level to the states. Nixon introduced a concept called revenue sharing, which was a big change from how things usually worked. Normally, the federal government told state and local governments exactly how they had to spend their federal money. But with revenue sharing, state and local officials got to decide for themselves how to use their federal funds, with fewer restrictions. Another thing Nixon wanted to do was reform the welfare system. He thought it had become too complicated and inefficient. He supported something called the Family Assistance Plan, FAP, which would have given every family of four with no income an extra $1,600 to $4,000 a year. But Congress didn't agree with him, and the plan never passed. At first, Nixon worked with Congress, but he started to change his tune pretty quickly. He refused to spend money on programs that he didn't like, even if Congress wanted to spend it. This led to some legal battles, with federal courts saying Nixon couldn't just decide not to spend money that Congress had approved. Nixon also had some pretty tough law and order policies to deal with riots and protests against the war. He used agencies like the CIA and the IRS to go after people who didn't agree with him, keeping a list of his enemies and targeting them with investigations. This list included liberals and anyone else who didn't support Nixon's policies. Nixon was really focused on winning the 1972 election, so he came up with something he called the Southern Strategy to get support from Southerners who didn't like the desegregation policies. To appeal to white voters, Nixon tried to slow down the process of desegregating schools, even though the Supreme Court had ruled against segregation in the Brown v. Board of Education case. But when the court told him he had to follow their ruling, he had to listen. Nixon also wasn't in favor of extending the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but Congress went ahead and extended it anyway. Nixon thought the Supreme Court was too liberal, especially under Chief Justice Earl Warren. So, when some justices, including Warren, left the court while Nixon was president, he saw it as a chance to put more conservative justices in their place. Nixon faced a big challenge with the economy during his time in office. From 1967 to 1973, there was a problem called stagflation, which is when you have both high inflation and high unemployment at the same time. Inflation went up because the government spent a ton of money on social programs and the Vietnam War. Plus, there was a lot more competition from other countries in international trade, and lots of new people were entering the workforce, which made unemployment worse. To try to fix this, Nixon wanted to raise taxes and cut spending, but Congress said no way. So instead, he suggested raising interest rates to try to slow down how much money was being spent. That ended up causing a recession. Nixon also put a freeze on wages for workers and prices for businesses for 90 days. That helped with inflation, but it also made the recession last longer. The economy was also hurting because the U.S. relied a lot on foreign oil, especially from the Middle East. There was this group of oil-producing countries called OPEC, and in the 1960s, they started raising oil prices bit by bit. Then, in 1973, there was a war between Israel, Egypt, and Syria, and the U.S. helped Israel. So OPEC stopped selling oil to the U.S., causing huge lines at gas stations and even shutting down some factories and schools. When they started selling oil again, the price had gone up 4 times over.